to Freya, who'll be emceeing today, and we can jump in.
Great. Yeah, so thanks so much for joining our third webinar, everyone. We're really excited to have you here, and each month is a new presentation giving you new insight in some capacity about potential pathways or careers in psychology or neuropsychology, and also giving you insight about what we do for work at ECIMH, or the Epworth Centre for Innovation in Mental Health. So a bit about how these presentations work. So we do have a Q&A question submission button down the bottom. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please post your questions there. I'll be keeping track of them while Neil is presenting. So we're not going to answer them during the presentation, but at the end we'll have some question and answer time to go through them. And so I'll keep track of those. And we may run over time. It just sort of depends on how many questions we get and how we go. So if you need to leave, you're welcome to leave. And there will be a recording of the presentation provided shortly within the next couple of weeks. So you will be able to access it through YouTube, and you will be notified of when that video is available via the email notification system that we've created. So a bit about Neil before he presents. So Dr. Neil Bailey is a research fellow at ECIMH. He completed his PhD in 2013 under supervision of Professor Paul Fitzgerald and Professor Kate Hoy. And since then, his research has focused primarily on the neural mechanism of action of mindfulness meditation and exploring whether EEG activity can help predict responses to brain stimulation treatments. So today he will be presenting a bit about that, and specifically how mindfulness and meditation works from the perspective of neuropsychology. So thank you so much, Neil, and you can share your screen and start presenting when you're ready.
Thanks, Freya. Thanks for the introduction. I will share my screen now. Please let me know if it doesn't work or if you can't hear me at all. But otherwise, I'll just get started. Cool. So my research area, as Freya mentioned, is the neuroscience of mindful meditation, primarily, I guess. But also I spend a bit of time looking at brain stimulation treatments and whether we can predict the response to those treatments. Mostly using EEG activity, electroencephalography activity. And the reason for that is we can get a really good measure of brain activity using EEG. I was told to give a bit of an introduction to my career pathway. So I've got a bit of a backstory, I guess, to my research here. I completed my PhD at the Monash Alfred Psychiatry Research Centre, which is actually where ECIMH came from. We moved to the Epworth about 2 or 3 years ago from MAPRC, but we're still closely associated with MAPRC and actually under the Department of Psychiatry, which is what MAPRC is now. With my PhD, I was looking at EEG to explore why people become depressed after a brain injury. It seems that people become depressed after a brain injury at a higher rate than people who experience spinal injuries of a similar severity. So we were looking with EEG to see if we could figure out why that might be the case. After that, and in terms of what we found during my PhD, it looks like brain activity after a brain injury, if people become depressed, is very similar to typical depression brain activity. So depression not following an injury. They're very alike, which suggested they can be treated in the same sort of a way. After that, I did about 2 years of postdoctoral research at MAPRC still, 4 days a week. I didn't manage during that time to obtain my own grant funding, which is a bit of a theme of this talk. For those who are interested in getting into academia, it's probably worth being aware that grant funding is really difficult to obtain. And so it's helpful to be adaptable with the projects that you do and how you do them. So to do that, I worked on my supervisor's projects looking at transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, as well as 2 of my own small projects run by students, honours students at that stage, looking at mindfulness. After that, I worked for 6 months doing postdoctoral research 4 days a week at what's now called the Turner Institute for Brain and Mental Health. And that research was focused on mindfulness. And for me, the opportunity to work out there seemed like the ideal opportunity, basically my dream job. They had millions of dollars of funding to look at alternative sort of treatments for mental health with a big focus on mindfulness. There was a lot of pressure, though, because of that millions of dollars of funding to achieve something quite large with that money. Academia is very focused on track records and highly competitive. And after a few very honest conversations with my supervisor out there about mutual work philosophies and how to maintain the track record competitiveness, both for ourselves and for the centre, I realised that that sort of approach in academia wasn't for me, and I quit, which was actually really a difficult decision to make because it was, on the surface at least, my dream job. Having said that, I was feeling so much pressure. I was basically showing all the symptoms of burnout. And so I realized, thinking about it, it wasn't actually aligned with my philosophy on life. And I don't think I could have continued to work in that way. So I think it was the best choice for me, which is something I would always say, for everybody considering any career, is to consider not just what you want to do, but how you want to live at the same time. So following that, I worked part-time supervising postgraduate psychology students online at Monash and back at MapRC just 2 days a week. And also part-time for Smiling Mind, which is a mindfulness app provider, a not-for-profit. And we were writing a white paper on evidence-based recommendations for mindfulness in schools. Eventually became, again, an almost full-time postdoctoral fellow at the Epworth Centre for Innovation in Mental Health, or ECIMH, as we call it. So this is the research centre, as I mentioned, that evolved from the brain stimulation team at MapRC. You might notice I've basically always worked 4 days a week, which personally I think is much better for our mental health. And it's part of sort of the realization that I came to after the process of quitting what seemed to be my dream job. I think our own personal mental health is super important. And if we don't manage that well, we don't do effective work. And so for me, managing that well is to work 4 days a week, which I think puts me in a great position to contribute as much as I can to work, but also live the life that I want to live outside of that. Eventually, I obtained small grant funding to run my own study, still working on my supervisor's research also, because that grant funding didn't pay for all of my time, but with considerable freedom to focus on my own research interests. So as a result of this process, sort of a winding path, I now lead the Mindfulness, Neuroscience and Mental Health team at ECIMH. I've got 43 peer-reviewed publications, so I'm pretty competitive for the large grant schemes now to enable me to do my own research if I'm successful at getting those. There's about a 10% success rates for the most of them, the large grant schemes. So it's still super competitive. But I guess what I'm trying to say by discussing this is that even just working 4 days a week and having a lifestyle as well as just focusing on work, it is possible to be successful in academia and to stay in there and to do your own research as well. You just have to be adaptable. So if anybody's looking for some unsolicited advice about how you can progress in academia, I would suggest that focusing on developing valuable skills, for example, for me, EEG pre-processing and statistics, that enabled me to perform maximally valid science, so to get the best answers out of the science that we could. That makes you employable even if you don't achieve getting your own grant funding. So you can continue working in academia even in the absence of your own funding sometimes. People can employ you and let you run your own projects at times just because your skills are valuable to the team. I think it's really important in academia to make sure as many studies as possible that are started end up being published. So a published study is worth an infinite number of studies in the filing cabinet. If you never publish the study, the rest of the field never hears about it. And so basically all that work was for nothing in the grand scheme. And it also doesn't add to your CV. So my philosophy, I guess, is if I start a project, I intend that eventually it will be published. And that also means, I guess, limiting the projects that I start. So focusing on projects that not only are interesting, but projects that I think will end up being published. I think it's great to collaborate widely with the useful technical skills that you deliberately develop, but to also focus on projects where you would be a co-author at the end of the project. So to be generous with your time and help, and to be involved in as many studies as you can, but also not to be taken advantage of doing work on a project where at the end of it you won't be listed as a co-author, because in that case you can't put it on your CV and you won't be recognized for that work. It's pretty important, I think, to know your motivations, your limits, and your priorities, which became very apparent to me during that time where I quit my dream job. And moving forward, it's something that I'm really pleased that I am aware of now, I guess. It helps me work in a more sustainable manner. Be adaptable where you can in order to achieve your priorities, but don't be afraid to figure it out as you go. So like I had very big plans, I guess, for what I wanted to do in research, and those plans are still possible. I assumed I would achieve them sooner than I have, but there's no problem, I guess, with figuring it out as you go, taking your time, and remembering that, you know, a 5-year plan is just a guideline. If you aim for it, you'll achieve some big things, hopefully, even if you don't succeed in the full 5-year plan. And so at the end of all that, the achievements from our team that I think are great and I'd like to highlight is that we finished the largest ever online study at that time. There might be more now, but at that time it was the largest online study of well-being from a community mindfulness program that showed more consistent practice leads to better results, so a better improvement in mental health if you practice every day rather than every 3 or 4 days. We have now published 5 high-quality studies of the neural mechanism of action of mindfulness, and we've got about another 5 on the way. We have the most accurate prediction of response to transcranial magnetic stimulation treatment for depression using machine learning approaches to look at EEG data as well. This is really important, I guess, because with all depression treatments, there's a fairly medium sort of success rate. 50-50 or less, generally for all depression treatments. So that means 50% of people don't get better when they're on medications or having a brain stimulation treatment, for example. And if we can predict ahead of time who responds and who doesn't, people don't waste their time or experience the side effects for no reason, basically. Ideally, at the end of all of this sort of research, prediction research, we'll be able to individualize recommendations for who gets which treatment and hopefully enhance treatment efficacy as well. So onto the sort of content, I guess, of this talk. I'll be discussing how mindfulness meditation works and the lessons from neuroscience. Just a quick definition of mindfulness. It's been defined as the awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. I would say that this is a state definition though, with no mention of how to increase this state. So if we're thinking about being in this state more often as sort of the psychological mechanism of how mindfulness might help with mental health, it would be important to include instruction, I guess, as to how to increase the state. So this alone is not helpful. I think a more important definition is mindfulness meditation, which is systematic training in mindfulness in order to increase the time spent in the mindfulness state and improve the ability to be in the state more strongly. So to give a really, really quick instruction on how to do that, the way I've been taught and the way I think is most effective is to focus on the sensation of your breath as you experience it around your nose and your mouth, being aware of all the sensations that arise, all the times when you're not even experiencing sensation there, and to maintain that awareness and always bring your attention back to that awareness with an attitude of non-judgmentalness. So just experiencing the sensations as they are without desiring them to be different, more or less, or any change in any way. They're just temporary sensations that you're experiencing right now. And I'll explain a bit later the theory, I guess, behind why that might help mental health. The effects of mindfulness meditation, they seem to be effective for a range of issues. Stress, chronic pain, depression, improved cognitive performance, particularly for attention, and anxiety. However, I think there's a more complex answer than simply, yes, it works. So in science, we talk about effect sizes, and that's basically how much of a change you can expect from the intervention. So mindfulness generally shows small to medium effect sizes, with the average meditator scoring better than 60 to 75% of non-meditators. And I think the easiest way to explain what that means is by analogy with IQ. There's not any evidence that meditation or mindfulness affects IQ, as far as I'm aware at least, although it does affect cognitive performance. That's a slightly different thing, I guess. But if mindfulness had the same effect size on IQ as it does for mental health, then the group who practiced mindfulness would show an average IQ of 5 to 10 points higher compared to the active control condition. So it's not a huge change, but it is meaningful, I guess, and people who do practice notice the change generally. There's a more sophisticated understanding, I think, that we can give as well to put the results in their appropriate context. Most studies of mindfulness have focused on what they call the gold standard of mindfulness interventions. So this would be MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And most of these studies have focused on 8 weeks of mindfulness practice. with on average 20 minutes per day of practice. So if you're thinking about trying mindfulness for 5 minutes once a week, you're probably not going to see the same effects. Also, if you're going on, multiple 10-day silent retreats per year, or I've seen research even on people doing a 3-month silent meditation retreat where they practice for 10 to 12 hours per day, we would expect they would show much larger effects. However, it's never actually been experimentally studied. We don't know the dose effect of mindfulness. We don't know for sure that more practice leads to better improvements. All the research so far on dose has been correlations. So this is research that I'd love to do and have a few grant applications up for doing so. But we haven't been funded to do that research yet for some reason. I would also say it's interesting to think about the extreme ends of the scale of mindfulness practice. So I think there is a minimum threshold below which there may be no point in practicing. 1 minute per day might be not enough to do anything. I don't know that, but I guess I would suspect that that is the case. And I also think there's a single data point that was actually filmed, documented, which suggests that extreme levels of practice can completely eliminate suffering. So I won't describe it because it's actually fairly confronting to see. But it was a situation where somebody would have gone through extreme pain, basically, but was a Buddhist monk and had been practicing meditation for 40 or so years, in the 10 hours a day sort of category, and doesn't show basically any reaction to this extreme pain. If anybody's interested, I can email a sort of description and even a YouTube link, but I just won't discuss it any further now. In terms of the mechanism of action of mindfulness, we would define the mechanism of action as the action that produces the desired effect. So the question that people who practice mindfulness sort of can pose when talking about this is, isn't the psychological level the most important for mindfulness meditation? So the mechanism of action would be practicing meditation, and the desired effect, improved subjective experience. And on an individual level, I would say that's actually true. I've talked to people who are very sort of skeptical about the science, and also people who are totally convinced by the practice and uninterested in the science. And the thing I always say is, if you want to find out whether it works for you, the best thing to do is to practice it, give it a chance, a few weeks of 20 minutes a day, with, I guess, a good teacher. Sam Harris's Waking Up podcast is a guide that I would recommend. And the most important question as an individual is, did it feel like it improved my life? The science is definitely interesting and can be used to justify, I guess, treatments and application at a policy type level, and improve our understanding. But the mechanism of action and the experienced results as an individual are the most important for that individual. But why would we look at the neural mechanism of action? I think it creates a more convincing case for the implementation of mindfulness. So for example, in schools, hospitals or prisons. One of our research goals for the team that I lead is that we would like to see mindfulness meditation in the core curriculum of high schools for about 20 minutes per day. And understanding, I guess, how mindfulness works and being able to convey that makes it more convincing to say, yes, it's an effective treatment, than just sort of waving our hand at cases where people's mental health seems to have improved, but we can't say why. Mindfulness the mechanism of action of mindfulness can, if we understand it better, help us enhance mindfulness interventions. So we can vary the parameters of the intervention, for example, how long per day people practice, to see if this increases the mechanism of action. And research has demonstrated that using this approach, optimizing the mechanism of action, makes an intervention the most effective and valid. And so the analogy for this would be antidepressants. If you're looking at trying to improve antidepressant efficacy, and your assumption is that antidepressants work by altering neurotransmitter balances and function, then creating an antidepressant that more effectively modulates the neurotransmitter function is going to lead to a better outcome, I guess, than studying just the improvement in mental health that people who take the antidepressant experience. So it could help us answer the question of whether 10, 20 or 45 minutes per practice per day is more effective. And also whether including yoga increases the mechanism of action. So the gold standards of mindfulness meditation, MBSR and MBCT, they all include yoga, but there's actually no research on whether that improves the intervention or not. And I suspect that maybe people would, if they're interested in mental health improvement, do better without the yoga and just more meditation instead. In terms of the neural changes, across studies, research has consistently found increased grey matter in the frontopolar cortex, which functions for meta-awareness, so awareness of your thoughts, basically. Increased grey matter in the sensory cortices and insula, which function for bodily awareness, which makes sense when you think about meditation as a focus on bodily sensations. And also increased grey matter in the hippocampus, which holds function for memory. There's increased grey matter in the anterior cingulate cortex, an area which seems to decide which neural process to enhance or is most important out of multiple competing options. And the mid-cingulate cortex and orbitofrontal cortex, which seem to function for emotion regulation and self-regulation. Functional MRI research has shown increased blood flow in the prefrontal cortex, which seems to function for ensuring behavior is aligned with goals, and the anterior cingulate cortex. There's also reduced blood flow and more control from other regions over the amygdala, which functions for emotional response and conditioned fear, and the default mode network, which is associated with rumination, worry, mind wandering, habitual self-referential thought processes, and is associated with depression, schizophrenia, and Alzheimer's. So why does this happen? Why are these increases in grey matter found in people who meditate? Grey matter increases could reflect dendritic branching, so more connections basically. Synaptogenesis, so growing synapses, more connections again. Myelinogenesis, so increasing the protective sheaths around the neurons, or even adult neurogenesis, so growth of new brain cells. Or the reduced stress response could result in restoration of neural cells or inhibition of cell death. But why would meditators experience more growth and less stress response? If we were just talking about less stress, fear, uncertainty, we could be talking about relaxation and not meditation. So what I like to say is that the changes in blood flow or the volume in the brain region that are associated with attention or mindfulness are not actually how attention is performed. To look at how attention is performed, we use electroencephalography, so EEG. EEG measures electrical voltage changes from neural activity in the brain with millisecond precision. So it's the same time scale as attention function occurs. This is in contrast to MRI, where you're measuring either grey matter, so it's just the volume of the brain region, or you're measuring blood flow, which changes over the course of seconds. So with EEG, we can actually get to the same time scale as conscious processing, which is what we're interested in. EEG measures voltage changes, which oscillate from positive to negative and back again. So when you look at an EEG trace, you see these brain waves. They look like waves, basically, and that's just the voltage shifts from positive to negative again, which is interesting. Everybody sort of talks about brain waves, but there's not much definition that I've seen in the media or anything about what brain waves actually are. So if you're interested, that's what they are. They're just voltage shifts that we're detecting on the scalp. Different brain waves have been associated with different functions. And this is what the waves can look like when you record them. So down the bottom on the x-axis, we've got time, and the y-axis is voltage. And each one of those lines is a single electrode on the scalp. And so you can see how the voltage goes up and down in a rhythm, like a wave. Different brain waves that we can record. We can measure theta, they call it, which is brain waves that oscillate from positive to negative and back again 4 to 8 times per second. That seems to be related to selecting the focus of attention. It connects brain regions and selects between competing neural processes. Another brain wave that we often look at is alpha activity, which relates to the inhibition of neural processes that aren't relevant to the current goals. So basically, alpha seems to be a distraction suppression mechanism of our brain. If you're trying to remember something and there is visual information in front of you, you get an increase in alpha activity in your occipital regions, which process visual information. And it's basically a don't distract me signal for the occipital region, which would be processing that visual information. And it's probably generated by your prefrontal cortex, which is telling the visual processing region that I'm trying to recall something right now, and I don't need any of that vision to get in my way. So in terms of meditation, we find stronger frontal theta waves during attention tasks. We find more synchronization of theta to the onset of stimuli. So when you see something pop up on a screen, your theta brain waves synchronize to when the information from that visual stimuli reaches your cortex better. And we see more theta connectivity between different brain regions as well. In terms of the function of that, aligning theta activity from the with the timing of the information reaching the cortex from the stimuli increases the neuron likelihood of firing in response to that stimuli. If the neuron fires in response to that stimuli, it's more likely to encode the information, and so it's better remembered or responded to. I kind of think that's just what attention is, in a way. It's just priming your brain so that it best responds to the information that you're focused on at the moment. So if we're thinking about it in that way, we could say the mechanism of action of meditation is just increased theta activity, right? But alpha activity also increases in motor regions that detect sensations that are distracting from the current task, and in visual regions when visual processing is not required by the task, which makes sense. You want to inhibit distracting information so you can pay attention to the important information. So we could say maybe the mechanism of action is increased alpha activity and increased theta activity, right? theta to attend to and alpha to attend away from. However, meditators sometimes show different distributions of alpha activity across brain regions to the distribution that controls show. And sometimes meditators show less brain activity and less alpha activity while still performing the same cognitive task more accurately. We've also recently had an honour student look at the different brain waves just while meditators are at rest, not doing anything at all. And in general, we've found that they don't show any differences to healthy controls, which is super interesting if you're thinking about, theta activity for attention and alpha for inhibition of non-relevant information. You would expect maybe meditators would show those changes even while at rest, but they don't seem to be. So how can we find a simple explanation for all of these sometimes contradictory findings? It can't be just an increase in theta or an increase in alpha. I think that individual brain waves are the wrong level to examine, and that we need a deeper and more elegant theory that accurately explains the variety of differences in the neural activity of meditators. I think that different brain waves perform different functions, which is definitely what research has shown, and that different brain regions perform different functions. Different brain waves may perform different functions in different brain regions. So if we're just looking for an increase in alpha or an increase in theta, we're looking at the wrong thing. Successful actions or processing of information or attentional function requires all steps in a sequence of brain wave and brain region activations to be completed, from the perception of a stimuli to the behavioral response to that stimuli, or a thought or an emotional reaction or anything, I guess, that would be the outcome that is desirable or most effective from that stimuli. With meditation, I guess the practice is to become aware of the stimuli as accurately as possible, with also that attitude of non-judgmentalness that I mentioned. So maybe meditation and the practice of sitting and just experiencing sensations improves our ability to activate these brain wave and brain regions in the correct sequence, from the sensation to the experience of that sensation and the reaction to that sensation, emotional or otherwise. So my hypothesis is that if meditation is improving attention, we'll see enhancements in the weakest link of the chain of neural processing that goes from stimulus to desired response. So we'll see theta enhancements during tasks that generate conflicts between neural processes. We'll see alpha enhancements in regions that need to be inhibited, and we'll see less off-task activity and other changes as required by the task. We're currently researching those hypotheses and generating, I guess, new ideas and new ways of looking at that. And we should see results in the next year or so. So hopefully that will be published not too distantly, and you can find out if we're right or not. What about the non-judgmental aspect of mindfulness? So I've discussed attention in quite a bit of detail. Attention is generally more studied by mindfulness researchers because it's easier to understand. So it's difficult to find a correlate or even design a task that tests non-judgmental brain activity. It's much easier to give somebody an attention task and see what that attention task shows. However, I think it's important to study both sides of the mindfulness training and the effect that that might have on the brain. And just a note, I guess, that there is this talk of non-judgmentalness in mindfulness research. I think it might be better termed non-emotionally reactive. So The reason for this is that I think a critical discernment of the consequences of actions or thoughts or anything that is a reaction without the emotional reaction is an important attribute that can lead to improved mindfulness practice. So non-judgmental seems to imply just accept everything and anything that happens without thinking about, whether that was a desirable thing to have happened or not, in terms of the goals that somebody holds. I think that's risky, because if that's what we're teaching people, we could be teaching them to accept a non-ideal circumstance. And I think it's more valuable to teach the ability to discern between outcomes and say, this is a preferred outcome, while still not having an emotional reaction to an event. So that's the non-judgmentalness from my perspective, to still act in a way that's aligned with somebody's values, with discernment, but just not emotionally reacting to when things don't align with their values, events, etc. So in terms of the non-judgmental side of the mechanism of action, there's a growing evidence that suggests emotions arise from the interpretation of sensations in our body. Antonio Damasio's written a great book called Self Comes to Mind that explores this idea. The best example, I guess, of that research is you get two decks of cards, and people can flip one deck or the other. It's a gambling task. One of the decks is biased, so that when people flip that deck, there's always a worse outcome than the other deck. But it's based on a really complex rule, and so it's hard to figure out what that rule is. After 5 flips of the bad deck, people start to show a skin galvanic response when they're thinking about flipping that bad deck. However, they can't even tell consciously which is the bad deck if you ask them. They just feel it somehow, but it's not a conscious awareness, so it's not going to drive their behavior yet. But it is a sensation in their body, basically. After 20 flips of the bad deck, they start to be able to say, I feel like this one is the bad deck. So that intuition from the sensations in their body has told them after about 20 flips that they're conscious of this one is going to lead to worse results. And then after 50 flips, they can identify the rule that explains why it's a bad deck. But first they experience the emotional reaction, and that can be detected through a change in the sensations in their body. If we're thinking about mindfulness as training to become more aware of our bodily sensations through that attentional focus on them, and also to not emotionally react to those sensations and to be aware that they're temporary, so we don't need to judge them one way or the other. We're thinking about mindfulness as a way of training awareness of the things that cause our emotions, and also not to have a secondary emotional reaction to that initial sensation. So I think that increased awareness of these bodily sensations is likely to increase our ability to maintain awareness that the sensations are temporary, reducing emotional escalation. And so mitigating the rumination and the stress that results from those initial reactions. There's evidence that theta activity enhancements in the anterior cingulate cortex are associated with more heart rate variation and regulation of that variation, and increased parasympathetic nervous system activation, so more relaxed bodily function. So that suggests that an improved ability to modulate neural activity allows meditators to maintain their attention on their non-judgmental or non-emotionally reactive awareness of the temporary nature of experiences. And that is without attachment to wanting things to be a certain way, reducing the secondary emotional reaction. This allows for more frequent parasympathetic activation of nervous system activity, enabling recovery and growth, leading to increased grey matter volumes in the attentional regions that are strengthened by meditation practice, and a reduced experience of stress and suffering, which is the desired outcome. So that's all I have for now on the neuroscience of meditation. Some of it is fairly speculative. There's, I guess, evidence for a lot of the things that I've said, but towards the end of my presentation, the hypotheses haven't been tested sort of rigorously yet, and that's hopefully for us in the next few years we'll be publishing that work. So yeah, as I mentioned, wait and see, and you can find out if we're right or not. But all of it makes sense to me, which is why we're testing these hypotheses, I guess. We have a couple of PhD or honours opportunities at the moment with our team. They're mostly focused on either EEG studies of mindfulness meditation or the transdiagnostic, so across different diagnoses, exploration of neural activity in different mental illnesses. So if you're interested in either of those, you can get in touch. I've got my email just at the end, so I'll pop that up. I'd like to say a big thank you to the whole team at the Epworth Centre for Innovation and Mental Health, in particular Professor Paul Fitzgerald and Professor Kate Hoy. This is an old slide, and she's definitely a professor now, and all of our external collaborators as well. And here's my email address if anybody would like to get in touch about questions on the presentation, or to participate in our research, or to check up about the honours or PhD projects. Thanks everybody for listening, and I'll stick around for questions as they come up.
Alrighty, so thank you so much, Neil. That was a fantastic presentation. So we do have a few questions here in regard to your presentation. So the first question is, how does fMRI or mindfulness work in practice given noise levels and distractions?
I guess the question asker is asking about people meditating during the fMRI. And with very experienced meditators, I guess it's not an issue at all. They've had a lot of practice probably at being distracted. It's probably an issue in less experienced meditators. And so we're probably not getting great brain sort of scans that are showing the mindfulness practice. Outside of the experience of meditation, so when people aren't meditating but are performing a cognitive task, and that's the research that's shown that there are attentional improvements because we're looking at attentional function with those tasks, and that's found even outside of the meditation experience. If they're asking about noise levels in terms of signal processing, fMRI research is fraught with noise, as is EEG as well. So noise, I guess, is any signal that is found in the brain activity or brain scan that's not actually related to the brain. And so there's a whole suite of mechanisms that you can use to clean the scan so that you're getting just the brain activation or brain volumes without getting the noise, so the artifacts that might be related to movement or muscle activity, eye blinks, all sorts of things. That's a whole process, but the field is getting. I guess I would say the field as a whole is sort of vulnerable to false conclusions based on artifacts, though. So it's still a work in progress and something to be aware of, that any research that you see on MRI or EEG is vulnerable to the conclusions being driven by artifacts rather than actual brain activity. So just a thing to consider when you're reading about the results of studies, I guess.
Great. And so a second question that we have is, why is it that practicing yoga, even surfing, when one feels a period of quietness within the mind, so not thinking of anything, is not seen in the same light as the traditional form of seated meditation?
I think it's getting at the same thing. So you're in a flow state, I guess they would call it. You're totally focused on what's happening in the moment, and you're engaged in that activity, increasing the activation of the brain state that is related to that attentional focus. The thing that I think differs is that that's pretty dependent usually on the activity. So you need to go surfing to experience that flow state usually. And it's much harder to get into that flow state when you're working on something that maybe isn't so enjoyable. So the practice of meditation involves sitting and doing nothing, and it's sometimes really boring and sometimes really unpleasant. And the idea is that eventually you're still training your brain to get into that flow state, even in non-desirable activities. And so eventually the idea is you can be in that flow state because you've trained your brain networks to attend fully to something, even if it's not interesting. The other side of it, I think, is meditation is hugely focused on bodily sensations. And so becoming aware of the drivers of emotional reactions in the body, I think is something that happens more from meditation than other forms of flow states. So there's not a heap of research on that yet, though. So that's a bit speculative as well.
Great. And I would assume that it would be a bit difficult to necessarily measure certain activities, brain activity during certain activities of flow state.
Yeah, MRIs while surfing might be pretty tricky.
Yeah, the whole brain would be alight with muscle activity and everything. So
yeah.
And is there, so you mentioned PhD and some research opportunities, but do you think that there may be volunteer opportunities as well, Neil?
Definitely. We've actually had a few volunteers work with us. Some who have taken a project right through to publishing the paper as well. And we've often got data that we are struggling with time to process the data and to actually write up the publication. Just sitting in a file drawer. And as I mentioned at the start, a study sitting in a file drawer is like infinitely less valuable than a published study. So if somebody were interested in volunteering, that's definitely something we'd be happy to discuss with them.
Awesome. And how does meditation work in chronic pain when the patient is aware that the pain comes on every day?
The theory, I guess, is training the awareness and also non-emotional reaction to the pain. So the more experience people have with just sitting and viewing the pain as something that is temporary, even though it comes back every day and sometimes just stays for a very long time, it is still temporary and it changes and it ebbs and flows, and accepting, I guess, the nature of it as something that is temporary and changes, even though maybe it's there very often, does seem to be something that helps. And so we do see those effect sizes of small to medium sort of range for people who commit themselves to mindfulness practice in response to chronic pain.
And we have a question here by Samantha, but I may need some more clarification from her for the question. But her question is, how important is leaning into discomfort, or have you looked into meditation that incorporates discomfort versus, for instance, being comfortable while in a meditative state? So I think she's talking about sitting and sort of being comfortable versus being uncomfortable, like maybe, sitting in a really cold bit of water or something like that.
I would say there's no reason to actively seek discomfort. But I would say that discomfort is going to arise if you sit for longer periods of time. The practice, I guess, that I learned was on a silent retreat for 10 days, and we were meditating for 10 to 12 hours every day. When you sit for 10 to 12 hours every day in a cross-legged position, it can be super comfortable when you start, and they let you have cushions and blankets and everything. But even just sitting for 1 hour without moving, as comfortable as you can be at the start, it's super uncomfortable by the end. So I would say the practice of not making yourself deliberately uncomfortable, but starting off from a comfortable setting and then just watching the sensations change and arise is part of the practice. And that is the thing that I guess helps you realize that sensations, whether they're comfortable or uncomfortable, are temporary. They arise and then they pass away, is something that is of benefit in the practice. And something on a 10-day retreat that you really notice. It's amazing at the start of a 10-day retreat, how painful, just even making 40 minutes sitting still can be. And then at the end of the 10 days, how easy it can be to sit for even 2 hours without moving at all. There's a real difference, and there's not been a change in your body. It's how you interpret and your relationship to that sensation of pain.
And so she followed up with, do you feel like you need to be committed to discomfort to get an enhanced experience? So I guess you spoke about how your mind gets better at ignoring those sensations or dealing with those sensations. So would you say would you say that's your response to her question, is that it can enhance your experience?
I guess it's not enhancing the experience so much. You're looking to get the best out of a meditation practice is to train yourself to view experiences, whether they're positive or negative, as temporary and not something to be sought out or attached to, just something that will be experienced and then changed. So I guess that's the kind of fundamental teaching of mindfulness, is that anything that happens will eventually change. And so there's no point in becoming attached to it one way or the other, either craving it or wanting it to go away. And so the more you practice whatever the sensation is, whether it's discomfort or comfort, just not emotionally reacting to it and just being aware that it's temporary, the more every sensation that arises or experience can be viewed in that same light. The more you're in the habit of saying, this is just temporary, even when, bad things happen.
Great. So unless anyone has any more questions, that sort of finalizes the Q&A session, but just want to emphasize that Neil is a walking example of researching what you love. So his love and interest in meditation has led him to do these 10-day retreats and explore it on a personal level, and then also study it and even implement meditation sessions at our research center via Zoom, and when people can attend and want to get some stress relief, and has even done some really cool projects with documentaries and things on meditation. So yeah, it really is a good example of follow what you're interested in, and so many different things can come from it, and you'll find your own niche, I guess. So yeah, it's really inspiring stuff.
Thanks, Ray.
You're welcome. All right, well, that's it for today. Thanks so much for coming, everyone. I hope you got a lot out of it, and video recording will be available at some point in the next few weeks. So thank you so much, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thanks, everybody. See ya.
Bye.